Thank you all for coming. I was totally not expecting there to be so many people here, and I'm really looking forward to getting to talk about this and getting your insights after. So last summer, Beyoncé released a new song featuring her vocals over a retro 90s house beat, singing about quitting her 9-to-5 and her refusal to let it break her soul. For maybe the first time, Beyoncé appeared uncharacteristically like someone hopping on the bandwagon of a cultural phenomenon already in full swing, rather than the trendsetter that she usually is. Amidst the seemingly relentless abyss of despair that has defined the past few years, environmental devastation, refugee crises, global pandemics, far right-wing political victories, just to name a few, which I'm sure you're all well familiar with, one rare bright spot has been a palpable shift across the globe in how many people conceive of their relationship to work. The United States has seen month after month of historic levels of people quitting their jobs. In China, Taiping, or laying flat movement, emerged as a response to a stultifying work culture. The subreddit antiwork, with the motto, "Unemployment for all, not just the rich," has been for some time one of the fastest growing communities on the popular website, attracting scores of people who cheer each other on as workers share thrilling stories of telling their bosses to go kick rocks. In a more formal expression of this shift across the globe, experiments in 4-day work weeks have reinserted the issue of reduced working time into mainstream political conversations where it had been absent for generations. As Kim Kardashian noted derisively, and many agreed cheerily, it seems like nobody wants to work these days. After all, why would we? It's been thrilling to watch this trend become sexy enough for Beyoncé to sing about. We might be tempted to declare once and for all, the girl boss is dead. Long live the anti-work feminist. But so far, challenging the norm of spending our short and precious lives stuck at frustrating and unrewarding jobs lacks the cohesion or collectivity that's necessary for us to think of this shift as a full-blown social movement. Instead, what we're witnessing might be more appropriately identified as what historian James Scott calls Brechtian forms of resistance, hidden individual instances of shirking, refusal, and evasion, rather than the cohesive, coordinated articulations that define a social movement. These have been nascent anti-work politics at best. Let's pause here for some definitions. Roland Simon, a French communist theorist who has written extensively on resistance to work, defines anti-work politics as the aspiration that, quote, work should no longer be the center nor the condition of our lives. These thinkers, like Simon, situate unemployment and precarity at the heart of the wage relation, necessitating its being called into question. Like other abolitionist politics, it is a political analysis which underscores that the problems with work are features, not bugs. Victor Serge argues about prison, and anti-work theorists believe this to be true about waged work, that it is a perfect institution. There is therefore nothing else to do but abolish it. Now, there exists a lot of wonderful literature that's come out in recent years making the provocative claim that waged work has failed to achieve its promises, that society should divest from our collective ethical and economic obsession with work. Here I would have pictures of David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, Kathy Weeks' Problem with Work. And these books that argue, instead for having people's needs met by some kind of a guaranteed income. And there are a lot of really theoretically rich and interesting arguments that these books are making. But the question that perturbed me as a labor studies and social movement scholar was, are these just always sort of individual and private feelings? Do they ever take the shape of collective politics? Do anti-work politics ever appear in social movements? And I argue that yes. There should be more pictures and pictures. One of the less well-known social movements that comprised the tumultuous, long 1960s is the welfare rights movement. In the early part of that decade, in rural and urban areas across the US, poor single mothers who were recipients of Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, or more colloquially, welfare, began organizing in local collectives. Inspired in part by the successes of the civil rights movement and many recipients' experiences in labor and tenant unions, they formed small grassroots groups that fought back against stingy and discriminatory policies that welfare recipients were subjected to as a condition of their benefits. These collectives gained attention by anti-poverty activists and scholars who sought to cohere their disparate projects into a larger collective. Amalgamated in 1966, the National Welfare Rights Organization, NWRO, which survived until 1975, became one of the most powerful historic examples of a collective effort at critiquing and reimagining the place of employment in society. A little bit more about the movement. There were about 25,000 members at its peak. They were primarily Black women, welfare recipients, and their allies. This is not because Black women were the majority of welfare recipients. This is probably more likely because they had more experience organizing and also were experiencing many of the more sort of discriminatory aspects of these policies, right? And their early efforts focused on addressing the most egregiously racist and sexist practices of welfare regulations. In some places, women could be kicked off the rolls if officials deemed there might be work for them. This was especially prevalent in agricultural areas in the South, right before harvest season, and was a remarkably efficient way of keeping wages at a bare minimum. Elsewhere, sterilization could be mandated for women as a condition of benefits. In many places, caseworkers could perform intrusive midnight raids to determine if there might be a man in the house. They would be looking for a toothbrush, slippers, any kind of evidence that the welfare recipient might have a lover who they believed should be taking care of her children instead of the state, right? In addition to challenging these practices, the movement was successful in demanding a formal system of hearings so that welfare recipients were no longer subjected to caseworkers' caprices. All of these efforts resulted in a rapid increase in the amount of benefits, the number of recipients, and perhaps most importantly, the movement's sense of its own power, rendering it bolder and more imaginative. While these early achievements, accomplished by some of the most impoverished and not unrelatedly politically powerless women in the US, are remarkable in their own right, what is most thrilling and too often overlooked about the welfare rights movement is the unique analysis that the activist recipients developed around employment and poverty. In policy proposals, songs, flyers, pamphlets, members of the NWRO developed profound insights into the shortcoming of a work-centric society. They made a powerful case for guaranteed income instead of the same tired promises that more work, better work, would finally address the poverty so disproportionately concentrated among women and African Americans. Now, existing scholarship on the welfare rights movement has interpreted this demand for a guaranteed income as being sort of an atavistic holdover that these women wanted to be stay-at-home housewives, right? They wanted basically a gendered division of labor where men had jobs and women could stay at home with their children. And I argue that this analysis is totally wrong and really flattens their remarkable radical political contributions. Sociologist Ellen Reese summarizes the main thrust of this argument that basically everyone writing about the movement makes. The movement was a, quote, product of its time. In 1970, only about 30% of married women were in the labor force. Like others, the NWRO embraced the family wage demanding poor mothers' right to stay at home with their children. In part because my analysis is so unorthodox, I'll take the time to examine three main components of their anti-work politics. There should be a slide now. So these three components of their anti-work politics are basically the argument that poverty cannot be addressed by work, that poverty is in fact constitutive of work. Another one is that they've worked enough, and I'm going to go through these in more detail. And the third one is really this idea that they had better things to do. They had other more important activities to partake in. As first and foremost an anti-poverty organization, one of the major arguments made by the NWRO was that employment does not resolve poverty. In a pamphlet from 1971, they succinctly summarized this analysis, writing, "The NWRO recognizes that people are poor because they don't have enough money. Poor people have never been able to secure enough income from the wages they earn to enable their families to live decently. Yet every man, woman, and child has the right to live." Members of the movement argued that poverty was a fundamental, irrefutable byproduct of waged labor. In another pamphlet, they stated, quote, "Is there a solution to the problem? Yes, a guaranteed adequate income plan would attack the root cause of poverty, a lack of money in a large segment of the population due to an economic system that thrives on cheap labor, high unemployment, and the concentration of the country's wealth in the hands of a privileged few." By situating poverty and unemployment as central structural byproducts of wage work, the NWRO identifies the problems with work as constitutive of the institution, refusing analyses that view them as merely inconveniences that could be ameliorated with reforms, right? And for me, in many ways, this parallels a lot of a Marxist analysis of waged work under capitalism. We can debate that at the end. For activists in the NWRO, many of whom had been working their entire lives as agricultural workers, as domestics, as laundromat workers, the then, as now, popular insistence that what was needed to improve the lives of women and African Americans were more jobs, better jobs, struck them as misguided and false. Their employment histories taught them that if hard work made one financially secure and emotionally fulfilled, working class Black women in the US would be among the most well-off humans on the planet. This brings us to the second theme of their anti-work politics. This is a very strange box. We've worked enough. Despite the fact that the welfare rights movement underscored that it was a multiracial effort, the imagery and history of slavery was a prominent feature in how the movement analyzed work, and their refusal to buy into it as their salvation. In this sense, it's an example of what Robin Kelley calls racialized class consciousness. One of the major ways they argue that historically work hadn't resolved poverty is by referring back to the history of racialized dispossession in the US. So in the spring of 1968, in their newspaper, The Welfare Fighter, they reported testimonies from a large crowd attending a Mother's Day march, including one by Miss Pearl Buncombe of Lamast, Mississippi, who the newspaper noted told it like it is. Buncombe exclaimed, "I picked cotton, I hauled wood, I done everything, and I got nothing to show for it." An explicit reference to the unpaid and underpaid labor performed by African Americans helped underpin both a rejection of work as the solution to poverty, as well as a sense of rightful entitlement to government benefits. In other pamphlets, NWRO activists rejected work requirements, which they described as forcing them to, quote, "work or starve." In the pamphlet Steps Towards True Welfare Reform, the NWRO envisioned a future welfare policy that prohibited forced work. This emphasis on forced, compulsory slave labor was certainly rooted in and meant to recall the brutal racial legacy of chattel slavery, but it also echoes historic criticisms of wage labor as a system of, quote, wage slavery. A major theme in anti-work and anti-capitalist analyses has been this emphasis on the unfreedom of a system in which some people have no other means of securing their needs than to work for someone else, and the extent to which force, domination, compulsion are intractable components of the work regime. Advocates of guaranteed income underscore that one of the appeals of this kind of a program is that it would undermine this work or starve compulsion, which defines waged work. So the sociologist Eric Olin Wright, for example, describes the structural shift which might take place through a generous guaranteed income as being appealing because for the first time, quote, the labor contract becomes nearly voluntary since everyone has the option of exit. For similar reasons, Kathy Weeks has described basic income as an invocation of the possibility of freedom. The third component of their anti-work politics, which I want to highlight here, is not just a refusal, but also an alternative, or as Ruth Wilson Gilmore often describes when she's talking about prison abolition, not just absence, but presence. So as I've mentioned, one of my biggest beefs with existing scholarship on the welfare rights movement is its insistence that welfare activists wanted to just be stay-at-home moms. Despite, as sort of frequently as this is repeated in scholarship, the archive reveals a very different and resounding emphasis. The NWRO fought for guaranteed income not so they could retreat to the domestic sphere and take care of children, but because it would enable them to continue the important political activism and community work that they were engaged in. At the time, welfare activists were hugely involved and remained so for decades after the movement's demise in mobilizations around education. There are some of the activists who ensured that CUNY, for example, the massive public university system in New York, actually had open admissions. They were really involved in housing activism, anti-police brutality, and many other really important political projects. You don't have to take my word for this, though. They said this really explicitly, that this is what they wanted to do with the time that their guaranteed incomes afforded them. In 1968, the US Congress held a hearing on income maintenance programs. Beulah Sanders, one of the key activists in the NWRO, speaks with Representative Griffiths, Griffiths describes herself as the most dedicated feminist we have in Congress. And so these two women, feminist Congress member Griffiths and Beulah Sanders, are sort of debating over what the effects of income maintenance programs are on women. Griffiths argues in favor of attaching work requirements and forcing women to go out and work as a condition of their benefits, claiming that without this, women would be relegated to their homes. Sanders responds to this argument and says, "This is one of the things that people are worried about, that they're going to be pushed into doing housework, cleaning someone else's kitchen, when they can be so much more valuable doing something else. What they have that is going for them is the nitty-gritty stuff. That is, out into the community, mixing with the people, finding out what their problems are, trying to help solve those problems." So to summarize, many social movements critique work, but they often do it in order to improve it. NWRO, like other anti-work proponents, understand that the negative elements of work are constitutive of the institution, and they therefore seek to eschew it. Work does not resolve poverty. For them, it institutionalized it. One way they knew this to be true was the racialized history of dispossession and slavery in the US. And finally, they rejected this classic feminist binary where women have sort of two options in life, right? Go out and work or stay at home with kids. Welfare activists put political efforts and community work as central to their productive engagement in society. This all sort of begs the obvious question. If the welfare rights movement was so profoundly anti-work as I believe it is, why has this been overlooked in existing scholarship? I think that that's an interesting epistemic question that we might talk about later. One sort of side note, I think, is that I think this inability to see the anti-work politics of this movement, which are so glaring in the archive, makes the case for why it's important to have actual radicals studying movements, not just social democrats who have convinced themselves that their vision of the world is the furthest left vision that anyone might possibly have. But I will leave that aside for now. And I think for our purposes today, what I want to spend the rest of our time looking at is a sort of more political question, which I think this scholarship can help us unpack a little bit. And maybe one way to approach this is by asking, why does it matter if the welfare rights movement was anti-work or not? This is certainly a question, right? I think historical accuracy is an obvious answer, right? Especially for a population, working class Black women who have had their voices silenced and marginalized. They deserve an accurate depiction of their analysis, of their profound insights, of their hopes, of what Robin Kelley calls their freedom dreams. Historical accuracy can sometimes be a real bummer. What I love about this particular historical accuracy, this always makes me cry, is that it reveals that history is teeming with more comrades than we're made to believe. I want to say that again. History is teeming with more comrades than we are made to believe. Organic intellectuals, working class women and men who, through their lived experiences with institutions like waged work, came to profound insights and radical alternatives. They fought not just for reforms, but against what Mark Fisher would coin capitalist realism. I think examining the arguments that the welfare rights movement made helps provide really needed empirical data for current conversations around topics like UBI, guaranteed income, work, care labor, and what people would do with their time if we weren't all working so much. One contribution to this debate over sort of like what should we be struggling for, right? Full employment or UBI, that the welfare rights movement makes is refuting the argument that the pursuit of a guaranteed income somehow abdicates struggles at the site of production. I'm going to talk that through a little bit more now. Let's return to the historic context in which welfare activists are organizing. When people think of the 1960s, I mean, Ellen Reese is correct when she says they're a product of their time, right? I think she just gets wrong what that time is. It's not the sort of aspiration to be stay-at-home housewives. It's a moment of radical, militant, working class uprising. The late 60s, early 70s in the US saw an explosion of labor strikes, including a historic number of illegal wildcat strikes, especially in the public sector. There was a surge in worker absenteeism, sabotage, rejected contracts. There's a famous quip that sort of everyone writing about this blue-collar blues cites. An auto worker's asked by his manager, "Why do you only show up for 4 days a week?" And he says, "Because I can't get by on 3." And one of the things that's repeated again and again by business leaders, by union officials, by politicians and scholars who are trying to unpack this, they keep saying, right, one of these politicians says, "The sons of bitches just won't work." Another union official is complaining during the Lordstown Rebellion of 1972 that this new generation of workers, quote, just don't see the disgrace of being unemployed. And what confounded bosses and politicians alike was why even the catastrophic recession, which began in 1973, didn't seem to be blunting this working class militancy. Business leaders were flummoxed by what they called, quote, strange and unanticipated working class obduracy. They voiced their frustration at being, quote, engulfed by a rising tide of entitlement. And they were trying constantly to make sense of, right, why even rising unemployment levels weren't having the anticipated and desired deflationary effect on wages and this militancy. And they concluded that the social provisions were buffering workers from the threat of unemployment, right? They argued, quote, the unemployed of today are subject to less economic pain owing to more generous income maintenance programs. They concluded that the unemployed, quote, posed no threat to the employed. And they recommended letting unemployment rise to, quote, intolerable levels in order to bring wages down. They argued that the recession should be used to drive home the point that, quote, people need to recognize their job is the most important thing they can have. If there was one thing that capitalists and radicals alike seemed to agree on in this era, it was that the effect of the social programs had altered the terms of struggle between capital and labor. And it's not just that these social programs exist sort of in the abstract, right? The welfare rights movement, their militancy, their refusal to acquiesce to capital's logic that one must either work or starve, that you must earn your living, helped to make it ideologically possible to think beyond the dignity of work. This is the ideological component, right? But the expansion of the benefits and eligibility that they fought for made it materially possible to do that as well. So a question that has preoccupied the left for generations, I think, remains pertinent here. Who is the working class and where is its revolution? For many, the working class is, by definition, at work. Its revolution is at work. Its objective is the perfection of work, rendering it more dignified, less onerous. To think beyond or to think about work from a position of refusal or abolition is for many to cede the terrain of production, to abdicate struggles over its conditions, as though we're sort of throwing life jackets to a few and leaving the rest to drown. But examining how guaranteed income works in practice, how work refusal plays out, is to understand that the broader working class is deeply linked. There is no strict floodgate between the reserve army and the working class. Marx understood this, and so too did members of the welfare rights movement. You know, Marx famously wrote that the reserve army drags down the pretensions of the employed sector, right? It scares them into submission. But the reverse is also true. A bold, strong, confident, unbowed surplus population emboldens the rest of the working class. And I think that this is one of the really key political takeaways from the successes of the welfare rights movement. And I'll leave it there.
Cheers, Wilson. That was fantastic. Massive, different, lots of different questions I can imagine. So that I've got myself let alone we should. But I'll open it up to the floor to kick off. Yeah, Andy.
That was fantastic. Excellent stuff. I'm always a bit depressed though when I hear about these inspiring movements and the way they were connecting up the dots and politically, you know, beyond their immediate sphere. And I guess my question to you is, what were the relations between this welfare movement and the broader politics of labour and trade unions? Was there any attempt to kind of create this broader coalition critiquing work, or was the commitment of the regular labour movement in the US still in this social democratic mindset of defending relations at work? Because I think there's really interesting similarities to some of the stuff around the universal basic income now, and the fact that a lot of trade unions are very anti it straight away, you know, and when you begin to talk to them about it, you're trying to begin to understand why they're anti, and a lot of people say to me, well, we like universal basic services, but we don't like the idea of just Milton Friedman and the people on the right were in favour of it, and just we learn nothing. So I just wonder what your response to that is, and whether there were any really productive connections being made beyond the movement with, because obviously race and gender come into this massively as well, in terms of the official labour movement in the US and indeed here.
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously the stigma against welfare, by the working sector of the working class is very strong, and was then. And Frances Piven, who was my advisor and who's written about this and was very involved in the movement herself, tells a story of welfare recipients going down to a strike of taxi drivers to try to help them figure out how to get on benefits during their strike, and they were just appalled, didn't want anything to do with it, right? Like that's for you shirkers, that's not us. I think I guess the question that you're asking is sort of like, were there formal links with the labor movement? And I think the answer is no.
Well, what worked in terms of making those links as well, is it perhaps
what would have worked?
What was there examples of things that did cross those, divides, and what gets just I've been trying to think about what can work now, because you can see the same sorts of things going on, especially with as you said, a lot of people that can afford it have not gone back to work post-pandemic. But my suspicion is that largely white middle class people that may not be in their 50s that can afford to think, okay, so how do we get through those cleavages? What are the productive things that do work, I guess?
Yeah. Let's come back to that, and let's get some more questions, and I mean, maybe you all can...
Okay, so thanks for the talk, really interesting. So I guess I was wondering why not situate the problem of guaranteed income in the context of the question of redistribution. Because it seems to me that guaranteed income is really a kind of policy instrument, right? And it's not actually speaking to the question directly of, who has the wealth and what they get to do with it, right? Which seems to me as though it's clearly trying to get at that, but not getting to that directly. And I guess, the reason I ask that is, on the one hand, there's a Milton Friedman type problem, right? That you have the far right who also advocates this, right? And then on the other hand, it seems as though if you set up the kind of policy instrument in that way, then what you do is you constitute a relationship wherein there are political elites who are in control of being able to direct wealth down so that it can be redistributed, and you set up a scenario wherein it raises questions of kind of vertical loyalty between welfare recipients and this kind of political elites. In other words, it sets up the conditions for kind of patron-client type relations, which we would not think of as the basis for kind of liberatory politics or something like that. So it seems, unless we focus on the wealth redistribution, then we're suddenly on a different kind of terrain. So I just wondered, what your reaction is to that kind of problem.
I think they were thinking about this as a question of redistribution, but and there are sort of beautiful moments of that being articulated. One of these activists went on a late night talk show where she sort of, is being questioned about, these like lazy pregnant women who just like have more kids, and she, looks the camera right in the eye and says, "The money in the White House is mine." So I think there is a real sense of sort of this as a product of redistribution, and the sort of racialized history of dispossession, I think, speaks to that, right? Like, we've worked for generations and not gotten anything, this is a way of sort of claiming some of that wealth back. Is it, you know, would this allow us to sort of like, so one of the projects of the welfare rights movement was basically to create a crisis in the welfare system as it existed, right? To sign up as many people as possible who are eligible for these benefits under the premise that the system as it existed could not survive, right? That it would create an absolute crisis. The federal government would have to step in and it would become too expensive to dole out these tiny little bits and to regulate who was getting it and what, and that it would compel this kind of major crisis in the distribution of these benefits, right? And I think, you know, wages for housework takes up this very explicitly, says that they learned from the welfare rights movement, right? And that gesture of, you know, so they call themselves wages for housework, but it was really wages against housework, right? The point was to compel the crisis and to require a complete overhaul in who does housework and how, not to just get a little check to stay at home and do your housework. And I think that crisis strategy, right, speaks to this as not just a sort of like, we're content with just a little bit of, but it's actually this broader strategy of how do we break the system. So maybe that answers your question. Yeah.
So I know almost nothing about the topic, so this may be a very broad question. But during the pandemic, the Great Resignation movement, or just these huge numbers of people who were just, you know, not coming back to work. Do you see any similarities and differences between the thought and activism that you were talking about and what was happening just right now, and still happening?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a nascent version of that, right? I think that what we're seeing is sort of the early kind of organizing around work and what its place is in society, right? People really starting to at least even talk about and think about how might it be different. And the fact that, you know, at least in the US, the largest protest movements in US history, right? The most sustained, the biggest, around the George Floyd rebellion, that those happened at a moment where people had some form of sort of guaranteed income through unemployment benefits that were larger than usual, and when so many people were out of work is not a coincidence, right? What we see is that when people have time away from work, they have time to organize and to be militant. And I think that is another parallel, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, that was so interesting. Just listening to you, reflecting there, some of the other questions made me think about your starting point, talking about sort of informal forms of resistance and subterranean resistance. And I was thinking about sort of old forms of industrial sabotage and how that's quite separate from, you know, formal trade union organising, and how those things are often not connected because the formal union doesn't want to be associated with the mischief and the non-sanctioned forms of action. So I wonder if there's something about this at the grander scale where, like take for example the smaller indie movements, union movements versus the big ones where there's a sort of relationship of irritant and involuntary, the sort of more grassroots movements versus the larger ones, and whether the bigger movements can't recognise or admit their linkages or be influenced by the more grassroots radicals, and if it's by necessity sort of almost has to be a diffuse link.
Yeah. There's a lot of there's a lot of really interesting stuff around the sort of like concealment, I think, which is what you're talking about, right? This sort of like strategic concealment. And this is one of the arguments that I make in the sort of broader project around why at some moments maybe their anti-work politics aren't so visible, because they're actually strategically trying to conceal them. Like they're saying, you know, we're looking at what happens to the Panthers when they are so explicit with their militancy, and we don't want, like, we can't afford that. It's too dangerous for us. So we have to sort of, like, we want the same things that they do, but we have to be more strategic in concealing it. And I think that that's certainly right. Strategic concealment is a part of movements always. And so that there is a piece of that, and there's also a piece of, you know, the sort of, that people don't necessarily recognize what they're being influenced by, or what's, you know, what's motivating them, right? That there's like multiple factors in why people sort of either see their linkages or don't.
Did you have a question?
I'm trying to formulate it. Sorry if it's not particularly coherent, but I'm wondering about. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how the state is positioned and addressed and confronted within this movement, and kind of what that might help us think about the contemporary moment in terms of this. Yeah, I suppose like an anti-work politics that has a demand for redistribution, which is contained within that is an antagonism, right, to the state. Yeah, maybe, is that correct? How do you see that, and what does that kind of tell us about the role of the state within an anti-work politics today?
Yeah. So one of the things that was interesting about this moment is that Nixon actually like really considered a guaranteed income. And the welfare rights movement fought aggressively against it because it was so paltry. He proposed basically like a $1,200 annual guaranteed income, and they were asking for $6,500. So, you know, they were asking for 5 times what he was offering. What is their relationship to the state? Certainly antagonistic. You know, one of their really bold strategies or tactics was occupying local state offices, occupying welfare rights offices, right? Claiming the spaces of the state, maybe, and taking them over until they got what they, you know, literally like holding people hostage until they got their checks written. And it was incredibly effective. And I think it's maybe, you know, a geographic, Hannah's a geographer, but like, you know, a sort of spatial insight from them is what we've lost in the loss of those, you know, like there aren't welfare offices really in the US at least anymore. There aren't places that you can go to occupy in the same, right? You fill out your stuff online, or they're so heavily policed that, you know, a woman in New York a few years ago famously got arrested for sitting on the floor because she was waiting for so long with her infant in one of these offices, right? Got arrested for sitting on the floor. Like, so how the state responds to this militancy, I think, has shifted enormously since them in the last few generations. Not to say that they weren't also met with intense repression, but I think, you know, the sort of like the force of the state in the past 50 years teaches us something about like why it's harder to do what they did today. I don't know if that answers. Yeah.
Yeah, Neil?
Hi, thanks for the talk. Sorry I missed the start. Yeah, I was just wondering maybe this came up and I missed it, about the discussion of strategies, because you said And I think that's clear pretty much everywhere. The welfare is quite stigmatised. So did they have any kind of strategies in terms of the representation as a welfare movement to go beyond that? Because I think that's one of the kind of central issues as far as I understand it. For instance, in Edinburgh, there's a long-term unemployed centre and a group Edinburgh Coalition Against Poverty, been very active in welfare issues, but it's never really expanded its composition to, like for me, what that needs to do is kind of make links with the most precarious working people, or people, low-wage people, and build a composition to see that those groups together are very forceful. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate. But I think part of the problem of that is the stigmatisation of welfare recipients. So I just wonder if there's any kind of strategies being used in that sense.
Yeah. I think maybe almost to answer this like in a reversed way, I feel like one of the reasons why that stigma sort of became so strong in the neoliberal era is exactly because of how dangerous the working class was when that stigma had been diminished a little bit, right? And I think part of what really, I mean, they talked about in their sort of materials constantly, there's this acknowledgement of the sort of initial shame that people had about being poor, about being on welfare, and the radical transformative effect that being part of this movement had on that, right? That it really eroded their sense of shame, that it empowered them, that it made them feel entitled, that it made them feel really deserving of this money. And so I think that that's sort of an insight about how ideas about these kinds of things aren't fixed, and that one of the things that shakes them up so profoundly is mobilization, is collective action, right? I think that this was certainly true of abolition during the George Floyd protests, right? This was an idea that had been a sort of fringe, small, radical idea that suddenly people were taking seriously and were really reevaluating en masse because it was part of a mass collective project, right? And that the kinds of stigma around poverty or around welfare could similarly and have similarly been totally shaken up very quickly, very, very quickly, right? That we sort of think of these things as just like so deeply entrenched, like everyone knows that we need cops and we need prisons. And from one moment to the next, people actually don't know that, right? That these ideas that seem like they're really fixed can actually just be hugely shaken up, right? This is one of Rick Fantasia's incredible insights about workers. If you do like at sort of how unreliable people's ideas about themselves or about institutions are, right? If you do these polls of workers before they go on strike, what do you feel about your boss? What do you feel about, people will have very sort of conservative, conservative in sort of all senses, right? Ideas, and then if you poll them like during a strike or right after a strike, that these ideas about the world, or what's possible, what's desirable, just explode, right? And that's sort of the point of praxis, right? Is that it totally transforms our ideas about the world. And I think that these women like really show that.
Person here, and then person there, and then this time. Yeah.
That's my question.
Hi.
Thanks very much. I have to say, I was expecting to get a wee bit more of a Beyoncé, but
sorry.
I also found it really, really interesting. I'll try and keep this to a question, really, is that did you detect any different trends or groupings or sections within the national welfare rights movement in terms of those that, about how they were going to get the power to try and persuade the state to deliver meaningful levels of universal basic income rather than just something paltry, below subsistence. And secondly, really, did you detect anything around people seeing universal guaranteed income as an end in itself, which you could say is radical, social democratic, or did people see that as a vehicle for unpicking the nature of wage labour, so something more transformatory in terms of revolutionary politics?
There definitely is like visible within the movement sort of different factions, I guess. Maybe that's the wrong way to describe it. I think one of the things that is interesting about the movement is that you have folks who are like very churchy. You have folks who were really sort of body and like, you know, opposed the man in the house rules on the principle that, on a very vocal sort of slutty principle, right? Of like, I deserve to have whatever man in my house whenever I want, and like, that's my business. And yet there was like, even within these sort of seemingly really different factions, I guess, or sort of groups, this real commonality that I hear coming from the archives, right? This sort of consistent position on work, on entitlement, on the remarkable power of mobilization and how it transformed these women's lives. So I think that's my answer, right? That despite some differences in identities, that they were fairly uniform, and I'm sure that there were folks who were more like, you know, after like an actual revolution, and folks who just wanted a check, but despite that, they really were sort of like unified in this project. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for the talk. I suppose this organization has disbanded now. Can you tell something about how it disbanded,
Mm-hmm.
when, and if you know anything about that? That would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. So the NWRO basically ended in 1975. I think there's a number of ways to sort of talk about its end. It's a moment in US history where basically every radical project falls apart. And in part, this is because of sort of state repression. In part, this is really because of this recession that starts in 1973 that just demolishes working class militancy. And the welfare rights movement is no exception to this. Basically, every sort of level of government begins really pushing very hard to impose work requirements onto welfare, as I said, like as an explicit tactic of reining in the militancy of the broader working class. And the welfare rights movement sort of falls apart in the face of this. George Wiley, who had been leading it, decides to leave and start a new organization. Explicitly, he says, like, of taxpayers, right? Like there's sort of starting to be too much stigma around welfare. He wants to leave. He leaves and goes and starts another organization, trying to appeal to a sort of broader working class, right? Not as isolated. So it's almost like it becomes untenable to maintain this anti-work politics in the face of this onslaught, right? The intentional onslaught intended to rein in working class militancy. And many of these women are forced to go to work. And, interestingly enough, they're forced to go to work in places where that had been sort of like public sector jobs. So in New York, folks who clean the parks, right, used to be like good public sector union jobs. And part of the sort of like neoliberal project of crushing the public sector was firing those people and replacing them with welfare recipients, right, at half the wages, none of the benefits, et cetera. So I guess to summarize, like this recession of 1973 really sort of does in like I think all the militant projects of that time, and they are no exception.
Any of these women still around? Do you know anything?
Any of these?
The women that make up the mobilization, are they still some of them alive? Probably not.
Yeah, sadly not a demographic, right? Working class black women, not a demographic that has a very long life expectancy for obvious horrible reasons. There are some folks who are still around, who are still active in different kinds of projects. I mean, I have like a Google alert on the NWRO, and one of the things that's beautiful is like, anytime there's an obituary of one of these women, I get a flash, and so many of them stayed really active and different, right? Like, they're like still in Black Lives Matter. Like they learn to be sort of lifelong militants, and continued that in different projects around working class reproduction, right, in its different forms.
Thank you.
This may be a highly counterintuitive question in the context of this talk, but I really want to know what you think. Is one of the inferences of your work that there aren't enough resources to go around? Could one safely draw that conclusion, that there just aren't enough jobs and there aren't enough resources to go around? As some believe in economics and in political science and some of the very wise people that I know.
I think part of the conclusion is that there are absolutely enough resources to go around. It's a question of sort of demanding our proper right to them. And that's one of the beautiful lessons of this movement, is that it's really fundamentally a sort of anti-austerity movement, right? And I didn't talk about this, but one of the things that I just adore in their praxis is really an insistence not just on the right to housing, to food, but also to sort of luxuries, right? That, and they have beautiful interventions into this. We're saying like, food and shelter isn't all of life. Like, just because we're poor, we also deserve to have perfume. We also deserve to have like a nice watch every once in a while. I think that the right to nice things and their analysis that waged work and capitalism cannot provide them with those nice things is a really beautifully profound intervention into sort of like why we should be anti-capitalists, not to generalize scarcity, but to generalize abundance, right? That we fundamentally believe that there is enough and that we are all deserving of it, and that capitalism can't do that.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really good. Your analysis was fantastic. It was really great to hear about a marginalised group of people who were incredibly radical and were challenging huge, huge political forces that were against them. Picking up on a few things that a few people have said. So Tim asked what kind of caused the movement to decline or collapse. You said it was largely the austerity brought about by the 1973 recession. So if we had a movement like this now, and we're seeing increased unionisation, there's a campaign called Enough is Enough, which is essentially trade unions against the cost of living crisis. These kind of working class movements are kind of beginning to build momentum. If we had a movement like the one you were so eloquently describing. Now, I feel like with the pandemic, we are both in a state of perpetual economic crisis, which started before the pandemic. It kind of started in 2008 and we've just sort of been in a perpetual state of economic crisis since the 2008 recession. But what would a movement that is, essentially I see it as a kind of, it's almost like an illegalist movement, the kind of thing that you're describing. Are you familiar with illegalism? So it's like deliberately, it's deliberately performing illegal things like wildcat strikes, but also just like things like shoplifting, these other kind of things. The things you were talking about were the sort of illegalist tactics of like occupying welfare offices. What would a movement like this, say we take all these tactics that they developed and they articulated in this movement, let's say we learn all their lessons and we have a social movement and we actually go out and implement those today. If a massive recession caused the movement to die off, why would that happen today, or why wouldn't that happen today? Obviously it's really impossible to predict the future, but as economic conditions get worse here, you're actually seeing increased unionisation, and an increased radicalisation of the working class rather than a decline in radicalisation. Maybe because there haven't really been a coherent UK government, so they actually haven't been able to crack down on these things as much. They've kind of like rhetorically tried to crack down on them, but there's been no kind of concrete things because of the extended Tory party crisis. So I realise that's quite elaborate, but if we had a movement with the same tactics today, do you think it would be effective in if it had the same aims essentially? So yeah, I know that's a kind of a strange question. If we had that movement today and it was active and it was doing all these kind of things that you're talking about, would it be at all effective, or do you think people are economically just like not? Do you think like living standards have got so low that there's essentially just like no class consciousness? So do you think it would be impossible? I'm just curious.
Thank you. How to answer this? I think part of this is like about what's sort of unique about the era of the long 60s, right? And part of this is like what causes such intense militancy in this time, and the sort of confidence coming out of like the Trente Glorieuses, and this sense of sort of like of growth, of expansion, of constantly rising wages, right? Like, and then the sort of right, both looking at that, I think there's sort of two things, like that starts sort of declining, and people sort of start getting like, but also sort of looking at that from below, right? Seeing like poverty in the midst of plenty, saying, we can put a man on the moon, but we can't feed kids in Brooklyn. Like, that's not okay.
Yeah, you could use the same example of Elon Musk right now, I suppose.
Yeah. I guess long story short, it's hard to predict like what will finally kick off mass mobilization that I think we all are desperate for, and that the climate crisis, necessitates, right? Like, what will kick it off, what will constrain it, what will finally be sort of enough to bring capitalism down, TBD. Sorry, that's the best I could do.
Bridget.
Thank you, Wilson, for a really interesting talk and something I didn't know much about. In relation to the minimum guaranteed wage, I am not convinced that that is the ideal solution, particularly for now. It would be a good idea, perhaps, in some respects, but ultimately, I think it leaves aside questions of what might happen to people like the disabled. Were this to happen, they might find their incomes actually cut. And we know that there has been a lot of orchestrated stigmatization of the disabled recently. The work of the Strathclyde Disability Unit has shown that in the last 10 years there's been a vast increase in actual newspaper stigmatization and news stigmatization. So I think that's a real source of anxiety. My personal view is that we should go more for workers' control of industry and more cooperative organisations of the sort that Andy Cumbers has worked on. But I wanted to ask you a question, which was, do you think that this was related in some ways to the student movement of the 1960s? And we know that the student movement in the United States was much more extensive and radical than it was here, and involved a lot of violent repression that is perhaps also not very well known. And it has been shown historically that the result of that student movement, sadly, was to introduce student fees in United States universities on a much greater level than had ever existed before, so that students started thinking of themselves as customers and not as people who were being given a free education and would have time to organise radical political action as a consequence. So I wonder if you've connected up at all the ways in which the public policy organisers like Buchanan, the Virginia School, combated the student movement by introducing fees, and the ways in which this sadly came to its demise.
I haven't thought so much about the relationship to the student movement to this. Yeah, and maybe that's my own sort of bias of thinking of the student movement as sort of like more a middle class movement. And
I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
You're probably right about that.
Yeah. I do want to just push back a little bit on the sort of concern for the disabled as being a sort of reason to be anti-guaranteed income. I think, in fact, for me, the logic of being really concerned with disability really compels us to think very, very, I think, favorably on a guaranteed income, right? That sort of anything we can do to stop saying that it's only people who work who are like good and deserving is pro-disability, right? That being concerned with the importance of all members of society, whether they work or not, is really sort of like absolutely necessary to take disability politics seriously, and that the sort of refusal also to engage in this like proving your eligibility, right? Refusing the sort of like means tested, I think is so important. Not just because it makes these programs so much cheaper, right? But because universal programs are just harder to get rid of. You know, especially I think in a post-pandemic world where we don't know what the long-term effects of COVID will be, I think it is sort of undeniable that there will be mass disability as a result of COVID, and that this really, really requires that we think differently about sort of what are people's like rights to be here, whether they are productive or not, right? What is their value? What do they contribute? And are we constantly going to be asking everyone to prove, are you too sick to work? Are you, like that this is actually guaranteed income is really, really key to sort of challenging the ways that capitalism is so ableist.
Thanks. Got somebody wants to come back in, but before that, I just want to see if there's any final questions. Yeah.
I was wondering, that are there any catchy slogans in this movement used by these folks? I mean, what are they shouting out at their protests? Because I'm really interested in the linguistic aspects in social movements.
What were their slogans? Was that?
Yeah.
More money now was one of their good ones. Mother power sometimes they used, which I think is this interesting idea about like the strategy of discourse in a movement, right? So scholars like pick up on that and are like, see, they're moms, they want to be moms. But also I think any of us know in a movement, like, you have to frame this stuff in strategic ways, right? And so mother power was a sort of like maybe a slogan that that they thought might be sort of permissible to the rest of society. The right to live was a really, really big slogan for them. And I think, again, this is really sort of like how it links up with this question of disability, that people have a fundamental right to live.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to come back in, Ryan?
Yeah, sure. So, so I just find this really stimulating, so thanks again. But, I guess I'm wondering sort of where you come down on the debate. So I'm trying to bring it to theory since that's the title of the seminar. Because there's this whole debate, right, about what is the locus of, let's say, class consciousness, substitute class with something else if you don't like that language, whatever, right? So, whether it's kind of the workplace in sort of classical, kind of like a rigid classical Marxism sense or something like that, or whether it's like the community, whatever you want to define that as. And it seems, and then there are different positions on this, right? Obviously, there's sort of a workerist, syndicalist type of position who wants to say, no, the way you develop class consciousness is by taking on the employer, and that's really where all the action is. And you don't even need politics. like that's just a waste of time, essentially. And then there's a sort of social democratic route, I guess, so sort of, social democratic politician route or something like that. It just says, well, workplace matters. It's all just policy fixes and stuff like that. But then there's sort of more community-centric, and it seems like that's really where sort of you're at, right? So it's like, on the one hand, there's theorists like, like Georg Lukács or something like that, who wants to say, no, consciousness is like the thing that comes from the proletariat because it's located in this particular place, in this overall system, right? And there's no other group that's located in that way, such that it sort of, it exists in the present and it has a sort of latent potential in the future. And there's no other group that has that characteristic, and therefore it's sort of that group that can develop consciousness. And then there are other people who want to sort of discount kind of workerist ideas, like Moishe Postone wants to be sort of anti-workerist within, Marxist theory. Then people like, Rick Fantasia would want to be more workerist, right? Because he actually sees consciousness coming through, begins Postone, he would be more on the side of Lukács. So I guess I'm wondering, if you want to put a horse in that kind of a race, right, around, because some of the things you said, like the George Floyd uprising was you said it was not unrelated, which I'd be interested in knowing what you think your relationship was between, having sort of unemployment benefits and then this sort of mass political uprising. So that suggests that you think it's not through workplace activities that one gains militancy, but it's through actually withdrawing from workplace activities and having some more engagement with one's community, and then boom, you get an explosion. So, so I guess there's different ways of thinking about this, but the consequence of sort of consciousness versus false consciousness, and if there are different kinds of loci of these in society, and work and non-work and stuff like that. So I guess I'm just wondering if you want to put a sort of theoretical course in that bigger kind of socialist theory debate.
Thank you for laying it out like that. That was really helpful. I don't know, where would we put Stuart Hall and the sort of like race is, what is the beautiful quote? Race is the modality through which classes lived, or, right? I mean, or the Combahee River Collective and their insistence that, you know, lived experience is the source of radicalization. And so that lived experience is manifold. It's not just at work, it's also driving home from work and your interaction with the cops, and your interaction with the border cops. And, you know, it's, I don't know, where do we chart those thinkers on this graph that you've laid out? Because I think working class consciousness does not just happen at work, for sure. It's also deeply gendered, it's also, right? So, yeah, maybe we'll have to talk about this more. Thank you all. Thank you.